Hey, Mike, we're unable to hear you if you're talking.
So sorry about that. Thank you. Welcome to episode 48 of the Political Mike podcast. After months of playing it cool on the debt ceiling, the White House has quickly begun to turn the screws on Republicans in an attempt to shift blame for the financial brinkmanship squarely onto Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's hands. As Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema, who has garnered a lot of negative attention lately, is betting that she understands her state better than the activists harassing her in bathrooms and trying to take her out through a primary challenge in the future. Facebook whistleblower stands alone and takes the oath behind a table ringed with photographers' mosh pit. And members of the environmental justice movement send an email blast more than 5,600 times over a 48-hour period to top Biden administration officials, disrupting White House communication and sparking a tense exchange between the administration's chief environmental outreach official and one of the key leaders of the movement. Here to help me break all of this down are Chloe Anduiza. Chloe is a senior studying political science and leadership studies at the University of Richmond. She is currently interning for Congressman Donald McEachin of Virginia's 4th District, focusing on constituent work, but also getting an up-close view on the federal legislative process. She has previously worked in the Virginia General Assembly and as a fellow on the Joe Biden campaign, working primarily in Miami-Dade County. Chloe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We also have Justin Perkins, another good friend of mine from Howard Law, a 2021 graduate of Howard University School of Law. Justin focuses his time exploring telecommunications and technology law issues. He has experience at Comcast, NBC Universal in their legal department. He also spent time at the Federal Communications Commission as a law clerk for Commissioner Jeffrey Starks, the only African-American commissioner at the commission and the 8th African-American commissioner in the FCC's 85-year history. Most recently, he received the Microsoft Technology Law Scholarship, which is an award presented to a student who has demonstrated a keen interest and growth mindset in learning about how technology can be used as tools to promote social justice, particularly in those communities that have been historically underserved by tech policy goals and implementation. Justin, always a pleasure to have you on. This is the first time I'm having Justin on and Chloe, so I'm excited about that.
Yes, Mike, super excited. Thank you for having me. Really excited.
And it's always a treat to have Professor Fred Cook back on the show, who was born and raised in the District of Columbia. He attended the District of Columbia public school system and graduated from McKinley Technical High School in 1965. After high school, Professor Cook enrolled at Howard University and graduated in 1969 with a degree in psychology and a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. He deferred some of his U.S. Air Force service and enrolled at Howard University School of Law, where he was the managing editor of the Howard Law Journal and chairman of the National Conference of Law Reviews for the 1971 to 72 school year. He graduated with honors from Howard Law in 1972, and upon graduation, he served as the law clerk for the Honorable George W. Draper II, an associate judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. He was appointed in 1973 a captain in the Judge Advocate General's Department of the U.S. Air Force and served 4 years in that capacity. He has been an adjunct professor of Howard University School of Law since 1992. He is one of the founding members of the Black Entertainment and Sports Lawyers Association, a member of the Washington Bar Association Hall of Fame, and a Washingtonian Magazine Top Lawyer awardee. Professor Cook, always a pleasure and honor to have you on the show, sir. I want to start off the conversation dealing with the stalemate that's going on between Democrats and Republicans right now over the debt ceiling. After months of playing it cool, the White House has quickly begun to turn the screws. So they're turning a new leaf now, it seems, and trying to turn up the heat on Republicans in an attempt to shift blame for, if things get to the point where the United States ends up defaulting on its loans, which would cause a recession, as the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has mentioned this week. He wants to make sure the blame is squarely in the field of Mitch McConnell. President Joe Biden he said that he entered the escalating standoff this past Monday, declaring that the Senate Republicans were being hypocritical, dangerous, and disgraceful. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki charged the GOP under President Trump for spending like drunken sailors and unveiled a chart comparing the debt they incurred. The White House is also planning to dispatch more surrogates to deliver their debt ceiling message over the rest of this week. I want to ask you, panelists, as it pertains to the the debt ceiling, uh, why is the Democrats' argument that the GOP was fiscally irresponsible in terms of how they accrued so much debt? Why is that message not getting through? It seems the way that the GOP's argument that look, the Democrats are on this spending spree of getting all the liberal wish list agenda items passed through. Why is that message not resonating like the GOP's message is?
Because the Democrats' message is kind of counterintuitive and garbled. It's easy to say when Joe Biden and other Democrats say, we want to spend $3.5 trillion or we want to spend $2 trillion, that people get that kind of on an elemental level of your own wallet of, well, where's that money coming from? That's a lot of money. And it is a lot of money. But as Joe Biden also says, the need is great, so the expense should be great as well. The Republicans are saying, you guys have spent a lot of time talking about how you're in charge. You're going to change the way government does business. Then you fix it. Now, I think that's completely bankrupt, hypocritical, all that kind of good stuff. But it's a simple message that people say, if you're in charge, fix it. And I think that's what the Democrats should have anticipated that Mitch McConnell would do. And it's what the Democrats should have had the ability to message differently and to act differently. But they continue to pretend as though the Republicans are actually interested in governance, and they are not. And as long as you play the game by their rules, you will lose. And they need to stop playing by Mitch McConnell's rules and decide we're in charge, we're going to do what we got to do, and we're going to own that. And we're going to explain to the American people what we did and why we did it, and not try to figure out how to allocate blame to the Republicans. It doesn't make any sense. You can't, I just don't get it.
Yeah, I really agree with what you said there, Professor Cook, when you said about how Republicans are not interested in governance. I mean, this is completely true. I think that their whole strategy is putting Democrats, putting their hands, so far up the Democrats on their necks that it's putting our nation in an economic tailspin, and all for the sake of acting as contrarians to the Democrats. And so I heard that they actually struck a deal to fund the government until December 3rd. But that is just a few short weeks away. So this argument is going to come back again. And so I think that's exactly right. The Democrats need to come up with a strategy because the Republicans' hands are definitely all in our faces.
To that point, I think Republicans are just kind of playing to the next election. They want to be the ones that were sitting there all along saying we shouldn't have spent this much money. We're advocating against that XYZ, and that's what's going to happen on November 3rd when there's a bunch of riled up Americans who don't understand why we're spending this much versus the group of people that need the help and are going to actually receive it through this. But I think the Republicans are trying to play the long game in that sense. And I do agree that it is just going to be another issue in a couple of weeks when they haven't actually resolved anything, just push the deadline back.
And while we're on the topic of the White House changing its tone in terms of how it's now being more aggressive in terms of casting blame for this debt ceiling crisis, the White House's new combative posture in the debt ceiling standoff is a concession because remember earlier the administration resisted dealing with the issue through legislative vehicles such as reconciliation. Out of the hope that at least 10 Senate Republicans could be pressured by the business community, by the corporate industry, and Wall Street to vote to lift or suspend the debt ceiling to prevent this fiscal catastrophe. And when that began to look improbable, Democrats tried to do it by majority vote, only to encounter GOP resistance. Now with the deadline, like Justin mentioned, just pushed back, really, just a few weeks away. There is little private or public optimism inside the administration now that the resolution will be anything but a nail biter. In terms of, how Democrats should have approached this differently, I'm wondering if you think, because Senator Mitch McConnell did want to have the Democrats go at this alone. He actually dared them to go ahead and use the nuclear option, which is the reconciliation process. Should the Democrats have listened to Senator Mitch McConnell and went alone through the process of reconciliation?
I think they definitely should have listened. I think part of the problem with Democrats is not understanding that the art of governance has changed. Governance used to be about bipartisanship. There were certain basic things that you could always count on Republicans and Democrats to come together on. In the Trumpian era, well, if we actually go further back to when the Tea Party started, that's when a lot of the division within how we govern started to come about. So I think what has to really take form with people like Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer is they have to understand that the old way of governance is not possible when working with these Republicans, unfortunately. So if they have any hope of actually moving forward and making any actual change and actually being to affect America for generations to come, they're going to have to go at it alone. They can no longer depend on credible bipartisanship. And to that point, I believe that President Biden is starting to understand that the Senate, in which he loved and he served in for so many years and was great friends with John McCain, and they were able to come together on things that no longer is in existence. So I do definitely believe that they should have just moved forward by themselves.
We go through this so many times, even going back to the 1990s. And, I remember when, I wasn't, of course, around, but in history, when Bill Clinton finally just said, let's just hold hands with this and get off the debt ceiling cliff together. And at the end of it, the 1994 class of Republicans that seemed to be on top of the world with, Newt Gingrich gracing the cover of Time magazine and everything, seemed to overplay their hand a little bit. And then you fast forward to the Obama administration, you see Ted Cruz's shutdown in 2013. A similar result seemed to have played out. And so the GOP seems to be making a bet, right? Two bets. One, the public won't understand, how to differentiate between traditional debt and the arcane rules around the debt ceiling. And then the other is that if the economy suffers, they can campaign on, look, the Democrats obviously don't know how to run things. There's obviously infighting within the party. You're seeing the liberal factions against the more centrist factions not even being able to come to an agreement about the spending packages that they want. Get us back in there. We'll know how to run government again. Is the GOP making a safe bet in those two respects, in your opinion?
GOP is making a cynical bet. I mean, you did me a favor and a disservice at the beginning by talking about how I graduated from law school in 1972, and you talk about 1990. I wasn't even around. What about 1972? But I think this, on a more serious note, this myth of bipartisanship is just that. There never was bipartisanship. There were two groups of old white men who did what they did in the Senate. And there really wasn't this sense of bipartisanship because they really weren't Republicans or Democrats in the Senate. They were senators. And there's a real mindset difference there. They weren't Republicans. They weren't Democrats. They were senators. They were the 100 lords of the United States governmental hierarchy, and they could do whatever they wanted to do. What's changed is that since maybe around the time of the Tea Party, when they activated this anti-government sentiment among so much of the population, that there was found by some people, most of whom call themselves Republicans now, some cachet, some political benefit to being opposed to the government. The government is a bad thing. It's doing bad things to you. And this is built up from years of resentment. People didn't like Social Security back in the 30s. And no, I was not born then. But people didn't like Medicare, Medicaid rather. People didn't like school integration. People didn't like the government creating regulations that fluoridated your water. And these small things built up over time to people really disliking the government, and the Tea Party mentality tapped into that in a way that hadn't been before because of technology and whatnot. People could get the message out better. And so the political cachet, the political benefit to some of those Republicans of being the opposition uh, and the enemy of government is really what it's about. And as I keep saying, they really aren't interested in government. What they're interested in is control. If they can get control of different levers of government, they can keep the government from doing the bad things that their people don't want them to do. It's not that they want to do anything. It's not that they want to have more affordable housing. It's not that they want to have cleaner water. It's not that they want to have environmental betterness. They want to keep the government out of your life, and they promise these people who are activated out there will keep the government away from you. You can make as much money as you want. You can pay as little taxes as possible. You don't have to worry about feeding poor people. If they can't take care of themselves, then the hell with them. And this mentality has taken hold to such an extent that Mitch McConnell can absolutely say with impunity, political impunity, I am going to do nothing to help this government avoid a financial catastrophe, and I'm going to keep you Democrats from doing that. And he doesn't suffer any political consequence because of that, because the people back in Kentucky, the state that gets the fourth most money from the federal government, they are the fourth highest beneficiary of federal spending. They give much less than they get back from the federal government. But he's talking about people taking things from the government. His people, his constituents think of it that way. So these guys and ladies who call themselves Republicans right now are a totally different bunch than the Republicans that existed when Lyndon Baines Johnson was president, when John Kennedy was president, even when Bill Clinton was president. They're a different bunch. And I don't know how you keep your job as a United States Senator when you jeopardize the economy of the United States for a political point. There is no substantive point here. This debt ceiling foolishness, which really shouldn't go on, is simply the government paying for the debts that had been incurred in the past. This is not adding any money. It's authorizing the Treasury to write the checks. There is no substantive issue. But Mitch McConnell says, well, you got to fix it because you guys are just creating a deficit. It's just foolish. But they're getting away with it because too many of the electorate is underinformed. And they go for the okie doke. And they go, yeah, Mitch is stopping the Democrats from spending money. And they aren't spending another nickel with raising the debt ceiling. All you're doing is saying, government, you can now write a check for that.
And the visuals of Jen Psaki, yesterday I thought was brilliant. I mean, she had a chart, and the chart said Trump, Biden's, Trump over $7 trillion, right? Yeah. So this idea that the Democrats are just spending crazy and we're going to be a socialist state and they're doing a bunch of unnecessary spend, when you really look at the fact that not one soul asked in the Republican Party, how much are we willing to pay for this border wall? This is just a little too expensive. Remember, we're fiscally conservative here. I don't remember anybody saying that. And Manchin and Sinema have a 50% voting track record of voting along Trump. But all of a sudden now they want to pull the brakes now on the Democrats. And when you look at the chart, I mean, Biden just got in there, of course, but he only, I was like, how much? $100 billion or something like that was the debt that Biden incurred in his tenure so far. And then we always end up in this situation. We're going to see, more of this kind of fake hostage crisis with the debt ceiling, and they're never going to kill the hostage. That's the thing, because if they kill the hostage and we get a recession and the stock market crashes, the party we've seen in 2008, the party that's always the one responsible for allowing these things to go unchecked ends up paying a price at the polls. Anyone else?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it just hurts Americans more when our senators and our Congress cannot act in good faith and find real solutions. And that takes us away from this economic strain that would be impending. But you're right, they're never gonna kill the hostage. They're never gonna not follow through. And it's unfortunate because it puts a strain on us.
Should Democrats have pursued a filibuster option here, what's called the nuclear option, a filibuster carve out to solve the stalemate? before the anticipated December deadline. Should the Biden administration have pushed for this actually much sooner? Only now, until recently, has the Biden administration seemed to, be warming up to that idea. Of course, as we mentioned before earlier in the show, they wanted to have at least 10 Republican senators to vote on board. Were they naive in your view? And, should they go this direction?
I think they were definitely naive. I think it goes back to what I stated earlier, just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the government is functioning now and the dysfunctionality of it. Wanting to come together is one of the things Biden kept saying is, I'm everybody's president, and, I want to work with you, and it just not grasping that they don't wish for you to be their president, and they don't wish to work with you, and they're willing to allow our country, our economy to completely fail in order to prohibit you from any type of win or triumph. So I definitely think that they should have pushed earlier. I think now they're starting to sober up and understand kind of the full trajectory of where we are as a country, and that the removal of Trump from office was just a very small portion of what needs to take place. And even though he's not a sitting president, in so many ways, he's a shadow president over Biden, because he holds so much power still within the Republican Party to influence these behaviors and these votes. So I definitely think that at this point, they need to push their agendas, and they need to do it by any means necessary. And if that means the removal of the filibuster, which I feel is, racist and frankly not very constitutional. And there's lots of debates about the constitutionality of it. But definitely they need to try to push forward together, because the longer that we wait, the midterms are around the corner, and we don't want to be in a position to where we've had all this opportunity to make these changes, and now we've piddled it away because of infighting and not really understanding where we are in our country. So I definitely agree. They need to move forward and move quickly.
When Kristen Sinema became the first Arizona Democrat in over 40 years to win the open seat, remember this was the seat that was held by Jeff Flake before he resigned. She was heralded by her party for breaking the Republican stranglehold that they've had, in that seat for a generation. This is a state where Barry Goldwater's brand of conservatism runs deep, and even back in the 1960s, Barry Goldwater was seen as someone who was a very far right candidate. This is before the Reagan brand of the same kind of conservatism and the compassionate conservatism sold by George W. Bush. But 3 years later now, here we are, 2021, and the novelty seems to have worn off pertaining to Kristen Sinema. Nearly a third of Arizona Democrats view her unfavorably, and that's according to a recent poll. The state party put her on notice of a potential vote of no confidence. She was greeted by protesters over the weekend when she returned home for a fundraiser, and then confronted Sunday by activists who filmed her in the restroom. According to it's a interesting situation because the Democratic Party was really interested in just getting anybody with the D behind their name in that seat, right? Remember, we were talking about taking out Martha McSally, and this was, during the 2018 midterms, which was a huge referendum on President Trump at the time, and we were just trying to get numbers in the Senate. We weren't really analyzing where she stood. And when you look at the record, I mean, she earlier in her political career, she was very much like a liberal firebrand. Now all of a sudden, she's opposed to raising the corporate taxes, and now she's getting in the way of legislation going forward And I heard a reporter giving an interview to a regular Arizonan, and they said, what do you feel? How do you feel about this? And he said, well, if you're going to buck with your party, we should at least know why. And she hasn't offered that reason up till now. We don't know, what is her bottom line. I mean, Manchin, he said, look, 1.5 was the number. I wrote an op-ed in the summer. I said, this is how I'm going to go. And, he hinted at 2. And I think, that's signaling, look, 2 is the highest I'm going to go. Let's go with 2 and move forward. With her, there's no numbers. There's no clarity in terms of what would it take to get her to join ranks again. And, I'm wondering if, you think panelists, Senator Sinema would likely be primaried in 2024. And if smaller versions of these 2 spending packages, the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, if they pass, would this reduce those chances of her being primaried, in your opinion?
Speaking to that, I mean, do I think she's going to do well in Arizona in the next election? Probably not. But to a different note, it's hard because, like, at least personally, my biggest critique with government is partisanship and no one being able to work together. And sometimes people only vote on party lines, even if that's not what they truly believe and what they want to do. And it's a mixed bag with her because, if it's not something you support, and it's not something that your constituents want, you shouldn't necessarily vote for it. But if you have no backing and you have no reasoning and there's no moral ground in it, what are you doing? Then maybe you should be rank and file. So it is kind of hard to go black and white on that. But I don't know. It's something to think about, I think.
Anyone else?
Don't know. I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, as was said earlier, the idea of getting Kristen Sinema elected was kind of a numbers game. We just got one more Democrat. Somebody with a D by their name. They got the sweater on, so they must be okay. And the reality is that Kristen Sinema never was the kind of Democrat that the people who wanted her to be a Democrat wanted. Well, she's just not. She never has been. If you look at her record when she was a member of the House of Representatives, when she was a politician in Arizona, where she is now is basically who she is. This isn't a real difference. And maybe she knows the electorate in the state of Arizona better than anybody out here does. And she's doing what is going to keep her elected because, she likes being a United States senator. It's a nice job, nice salary, nice perks. And I don't want to go back to whatever else I was doing. So I want to be a senator and I'm going to do the things that I need to do. And she's been very busy over the last few weeks, scooping up campaign contributions, trying to kill somebody running against her as in a primary. She's trying to suck all the money up out of the race so that whoever runs against her won't have any cash. And maybe that's a strategy that'll win for her. But the challenge the Democrats continue to have is that the party is so diverse that you have people with such disparate interests within the party who call themselves Democrats that it's hard to maintain solidarity or a common position, especially when you have no working margin. If there were 75 Democrat senators, it wouldn't make any difference what Kristen Sinema did. But when you literally need every Democrat senator vote, then Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin take on an outsized level of responsibility or importance. And the party has suffered from this for years and years and years. And again, I keep coming back to it. The Republicans don't suffer from this because they don't give a good God bless about governance. They don't want to govern. They just want power. They want to be in charge and keep the government off their necks. And it's real easy to do that. It's real easy to be no. It's much more difficult to be for something. It's much more difficult to develop a cohesive governing strategy and series of policies and implement them. If all you're going to say is no, you can find 1,000 people who say no.
I always wondered, with Manchin too. I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, Manchin he's the only Democrat we can get West Virginia." In my view, what's the point of having a senator from West Virginia and a senator from Arizona if you're not going to vote when it counts? in my view, I mean, it would have been better to have a minority and then campaign on this is what we would have done. Give us somebody in Wisconsin. Ron Johnson's going to be, I think he's retiring. Give us Val Demings in Florida, right? Give us people who would actually vote with the party. I mean, look at Warnock. Warnock is up for election again, and the odds of him winning in Georgia are very, we don't even know who this competitor are, but they have the advantage already, and he's still voting with the party line because of the way he can point to these tangible benefits, COVID-19 relief. He's voting for the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation package. There's no big news coming out of Georgia because of that. And the thing that also makes me confused is like, you're not winning the opinion. You're not winning the favor of Republicans. I heard Meghan McCain say, oh, well, she's the only one holding the conservative line, so Democrats need to back off. If, in my view, we're not. What Republican senator are there that are in the Senate right now because they're the best person from their state that Democrats like? What Republican senator is there because Democrats like them enough to get enough votes? And the thing is crazy because you're not winning the side of the right. You're losing, favorability on the party that brought you to the dance. And what are you going to have left as a coalition when the time comes for you to go ahead and knock on doors and campaign again? It doesn't make sense to me, in my view. And the thing is, like, when you don't even have a consistent voting record, it makes it worse because then people really feel like they don't know where you stand and where you're going to stand between now and the next election. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, if Senator Sinema is garnering all this negative press and attention, why do you think she's still obstructing the infrastructure bill and reconciliation bill? What does she stand to gain at this point?
Votes in Arizona. People in Arizona don't want the government spending $3.5 trillion that their children and grandchildren are going to have to pay back. It's almost as simple as that. Now, I think all that's misguided, but there's a saying in politics that if you spend more than 15 or 20 seconds explaining something, you're losing, okay? Because if you can't explain it in a short amount of time, in simple words, then you're going to lose the conversation. And that, when you have to go through, and the Democrats and Joe Biden, all of them have done a horrible job of explaining what the human infrastructure bill has in it, why it's a good idea, so they can attract support among the populace and maybe pressure on elected officials. But when people don't really know what it is, but what they do know, $3.5 trillion is a lot of money. I don't care how you slice and dice it. That's a lot of cake. And who's going to pay for that? And they haven't talked about the pay for enough. So it's just really easy for people to sort of reflexively go, whoa, that's a lot of money. And we know the government's inefficient and they're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of it's going to get wasted and stolen. And in point of fact, Republicans have been telling people, because it's a fact, the COVID relief money, most of it has not been spent. It is difficult to spend $1 trillion. Government isn't very good at that. And if you're going to spend $3.5 trillion over 8 or 10 years, that's a huge amount of cash in a system that will choke on that much cash. And so people go, well, what are we doing? If we're not really going to spend 3.5 trillion, why are we promising to spend 3.5 trillion? Let's spend a number that we can spend. And so I think Kristen Sinema is much closer to the people she needs to get to vote for her in Arizona, whether they call themselves Democrats or Republicans or independents, than, say, Chuck Schumer is.
No, that's a great point, because when you go to buy a car, the salesman, he doesn't start off with the price. He takes you to come and see what's in there with the features and everything, the mileage, how the year and everything. And once you're hooked on what it can do, once you're hooked on the tangibles, then we can talk price, right? And the Democrats, to your point, Professor, and even Chris Matthews, when he was on the show a few weeks back, said, they make such horrible messengers because instead of focusing on numbers, numbers sound scary. They make for great campaign ads. Focus on the fact that in the bill, you have a lot of items that people actually would like. You're talking about paid family and medical leave for the first time in U.S. history. We would have a comprehensive paid leave covering 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave. Up to $4,000 a month. You're talking about cutting prescription drug prices, extending the child tax credit, and the environment. There's so much is being invested in terms of ensuring that we're investing in renewable energy and clean sources of power, childcare and universal pre-K, 2 free years of community college. I mean, and this is the thing, the majority of people, when you look at polls after polls, they want these things because it means a tangible difference between point A and point B. If I get the ticket to get into a better life, the chance of getting into a better opportunity for employment, it resonates differently than talking about $3.5 trillion. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to state that I definitely agree that the biggest issue that Democrats have is messaging. Because this issue has become so pulverized, they have to figure out who can be the messenger. They have to find someone that is seen as neutral, not seen as problematic. They can't have AOC. They can't have Bernie Sanders. They can't have Nancy Pelosi. Like, they really have to look at who they could bring out in front to really provide the nuts and bolts of what this bill provides. Because I believe strongly on my own show, when I stated what was in this bill and how it would be transformative, not just for families, but for us as a society, I got inundated with messages of people saying, I had no idea this is what it was. That's because, like Mike said, they're focusing on the wrong thing. Don't tell me about the price tag. Tell me about all the good things that I'm getting. Because when people understand what they can gain, price tag very rarely comes into the picture. If it's something that is necessary for yourself or for your family or for your livelihood, even if you can't afford it, you're going to find the money. Wherever you can find that money, you're going to find it. And the price tag is now not any part of a consequence. So I think that's what Democrats have to do. They have to figure out who they can bring to be their messenger so that they can really explain to the electorate how consequential and necessary and beneficial this is going to be, not just for us, but for generations to come.
Yeah, and what surprised me was that even with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, even she made a reasonable point to me and said, look, even if we're going to get a smaller package, it would make sense to do a smaller package over, say, 5 years, right? And that way you're consolidating the amount of money for specific programs so they get a taste for it. And then when you get a taste for it, you want the rest, I
agree 100%. I think that's what they need to do. They need to focus on working with Manchin, get the things in the bill that would be the most like attention getters, right? And then let people see that. And then if we can continue to secure these majorities, because once people get a taste of this, just like with the Affordable Care Act, they're going to want it. They're going to like it. They're going to want to maintain it. You have people talking about, don't make keep the government out of my medical and all this kind of stuff. And then when the Republicans were trying to repeal it, people were in the streets like, wait a minute, whoa. That's because they got a taste of what that was and they liked it. Right. So I definitely agree with AOC. If they are if they can come together enough and Democrats can admit that they're just not going to get everything in one swoop. And that's OK, because if we can get the things in there that are extremely necessary, get the electorate used to, receiving these different benefits and living, decently and better lives, then we can whet their appetite again once we can continue to secure the majority to get the rest. Sometimes it's not always about doing it all at once. Sometimes you have to break it up.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, all you folks are much younger than I, and I say that respectfully because, I'm curious as to what it is you folks want to hear from the elected leaders. Like Nancy Pelosi and my good friend Jim Clyburn and these other people, they're all 80 years old. And they talk a certain way and they have a certain worldview that's born out of that experience. And that's okay. But you folks are the future much more than they are. And I'm just really curious as to what do you want to hear? What resonates with you about this? I thought Ms. Bryant was very enlightening because I feel like sometimes when we say to the activists, the progressive activists, well, look, you can't get it all right now. This has got to be an incremental proposition. And you said that, and I think that makes a lot of sense, but I know that I think that way, but I'm a million years old. I'm just trying to understand what works for you guys.
I'm going to say, I think even going back to the healthcare debate in the 1990s, Democrats have always had that struggle of, are we going to get it all now, take all or nothing, or are we going to get it in pieces? And whenever we have the opportunity to really get something monumental moving down the road, some of the loudest voices argue for, well, if we're not going to get X, Y, and Z, then it's not worth having it all. And I personally think it's a mistake. I mean, we've seen it when it comes down to immigration. We saw it when it comes down to, healthcare up until we had enough votes in 2009 and 2010 to actually make up a majority in both houses of Congress to get it passed regardless. Those kind of golden opportunity moments come rare for the Democrats. And meanwhile, the Republicans are able to ram through a 2017 monumental tax cut, and no one bats an eye about that. Nobody asks who's going to pay for this. Nobody asks where's this funding coming from, and nobody complains about how this is going to, put a huge strain on the economy. I think in addition to the messaging, we have this idea where, we're operating with the same, electorate and world as the same that existed during the civil rights era, where we're able to pass monumental things and get reasonable people in the middle of the road who, for selfish reasons for their constituents, went on board with this thing. But I think, we're not as adaptable as the GOP seems to be. The GOP moves in lockstep. We have these debates and, in-party fighting, and we go on cable news and, we have all these differences of opinion, and time goes by and times go by. And then next, we run out and the clock and everyone's focused on re-election again. So in my view, I think, incremental change is the way to go.
Yeah, I will say to you, you mentioned the civil rights laws, having been around when that was going on, that was incrementalism, because there was a huge group of people who said that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not go far enough. But what people got convinced or persuaded to do, we will support this because this is the best we can do right now, and we'll come back and get some more later. And that happened throughout that. And so when I see a lot of younger progressive folks, many of whom happen not to be African American, who absolutely insist on everything right now or will burn the whole house down, I kind of go, well, it oftentimes doesn't work that way. And minority folk, women, have had for years, for 400 years in this country, had to take incremental steps to get where we are today. Nobody, they could have done the 13th Amendment, 1776 plus one, but they didn't. They waited a long time to pass the 13th Amendment. And it took them another 100 years almost to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64. So this has all been an incremental thing. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Maybe not. I don't know. But it seems to be the way it plays out. And so I think that, Joe Biden makes a great case that there's a huge need, and 3.5 trillion could address that need. But maybe the country as a whole isn't ready to go for 3.5 trillion, and maybe the country will live with the $1 trillion. Okay, let's take that and try to convince them, as we said, get them drunk on the $1 trillion 5, and then when they get addicted to that, we'll come back and say, well, if you want some more of that, you got to give us some more money.
Another big headline that happened this past week was that, you had a former Facebook employee, Frances Haugen, saying that Facebook has put their astronomical profits before people. She was interviewed on Sunday by CBS on the 60 Minutes show, saying that the social media network reportedly prioritized growth over safety, and she said that it's tearing our societies apart. She also, it was a very telling interview, because in the interview she had mentioned that there were precautions in place before the election, but once that period between the election and the inauguration happened, those safeguards were removed, as if, we don't need this anymore. We might as well get back to business as usual. And of course, we know that Facebook and other sources were used as repositories where folks can gather and plot, events like January 6th and other, anti-vax events and things like that. So, she's saying that she was also appearing before the Senate, and she, the former product manager of Facebook, accused the social network giant of threatening children's safety, the integrity of democracy. She urged Congress to take action to rein in a largely unregulated company. Facebook, I think, is probably the granddaddy of them all in terms of social media, going back to 2004. Mark Zuckerberg and Harvard. She says the drama, that Facebook has experienced with its product is due to a lack of urgency to get involved and intervene, because of the fact that people tend to gravitate to content that makes them angry more. I want to get your thoughts about this situation. Who seems to be right? Because you also have the Facebook executives, Mark Zuckerberg himself, also saying, look, you're portraying Facebook in a light that's unfavorable. We're always trying to be cautious. We do care about our customers. We do care about the content that's being displayed. Who do you think is right in this public dispute? And this also took place in the backdrop of an outage this past Monday. And I felt like it was just my Facebook that wasn't working, and I'm sure other folks felt the same way. But it just showed you how heavily dependent a lot of people are on Facebook. And this was the longest outage it was. So that just seemed to emphasize, it was so weird in terms of how it happened this week. It just emphasized how major of a role Facebook plays in our society.
Well, I think that there's a couple layers to this discussion. One, the way that Facebook has been behaving is very antitrust, and it has bought out and annihilated other companies that would have competed with it. So when it went out, there were countries, not the United States, that were actually pretty devastated by it, because a lot of their infrastructure, government and otherwise, is based around Facebook apps. So it's it shows that there's like very tangible and practical dangers to allowing a monopolistic tech giant to continue that way. I don't take Mark Zuckerberg's word for face value. I don't believe him, fundamentally. I think that our whistleblower was speaking in good faith. However, I do believe that there needs to be a more nuanced discussion about what kind of regulation does happen, because what it does boil down to is essentially a discussion of censorship. And that is always a tricky discussion, especially if we're going to either let companies self-regulate, which we know doesn't work well. I'm an environmental justice particular person, and I've seen that chemical companies, for example, do not self-regulate well, and when the government is able to intervene, it's very limited. And I think that there's a danger, especially when it comes to censorship, of allowing Facebook to self-regulate, because we see that they didn't in such a way that actually protected the populace. But we also don't want to allow a third-party government agency to have that kind of power over people's individual speech, when we've just seen with the outage how much it's integral to everyone on the globe. In the United States, it's for social, purposes, but elsewhere, it's much more integral. So there should be more discussion about regulation. I would be cautious, and I would really want to see some fleshed out and transparent policy around it, because otherwise we might see true censorship, because we don't necessarily know what future governments and administrations would do.
And the thing is, the very last paper I wrote at Howard Law was pertaining to reforming Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And of course, when you do that, what you're basically saying is, in terms of what I was arguing for, was allowing companies like Facebook to be able to be exposed to liability, hoping that would somehow, I guess, serve as an incentive for them to take more of an active role in terms of what kind of content is being shared. I mean, you're talking about things that are just blatantly false about vaccinations, things that, and it has real tangible consequences, let alone the police officers that were injured and killed on January 6th. But you're also talking about in Dodgers Stadium in California, a gathering that prevented so many people from getting vaccinated because of the chaos that resulted there. You're talking about, all other programs and events that have been used. I mean, that Facebook has been the platform, or even this other place called Parler. All these social media companies have been used as these gathering places, especially in the age where where people can't even meet physically. So, would, in your opinion, reforming Section 230, because it did seem like this was one of those odd and rare moments when both Democrats and Republicans were both grilling equally intensely. Mark Zuckerberg, anytime he came before the Senate, I was there when he came before the Senate in 2018. And I was able to sit there in person, and I saw, just both, you had Ted Cruz, you had you had Blumenthal, everyone seemed to be taking this thing seriously. It wasn't, sometimes with these hearings, you have one narrative being told and another narrative being told by both sides of the aisle, and then we're not getting anywhere. But here it seemed like, look, something can actually be done here. But would reforming Section 230, in your view, actually result in social media companies being more cautious in, what content is being displayed on their platform?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Proposing the idea of reforming Section 230. I mean, it's an interesting idea to think about, because on one hand, it would make social media companies liable for the posts that are published on their site. But on the other hand, it would completely change the way that these sites behave. There may be more security needed to get in. They might have to, wait for our posts to go through. Our photos might be checked before they're published. So it would be a real shift in the way of our internet culture that's much more different from now, which is so much more instantly connecting our thoughts and ideas and our content to the rest of the world so instantly. So reforming Section 230 would really mark a shift in the 21st century in this decade too, about how we think about using the internet and how social companies interact with us, the consumer.
Yeah, but how do you do that? How do you keep those companies from imposing constraints on your ability to communicate because they are trying to protect themselves from a lawsuit? So is that a good thing? Is that a happy place to be when Google or some variant decides that your text messages, your Instagram feed has to be monitored by them, sanitized by them, so that they can be as sure as they can that they won't get sued for something you did? And I don't know if that's a good place to be.
Oh yeah. No, I agree with that. I don't think that's a good place to be either. And that really runs into a lot of our public safety and privacy issues too. I mean, here in the United States, our Congress has yet to pass a major watershed privacy legislation that would force companies to protect our personal information and our personal messages. So it's really interesting to see that, yeah, on one hand, they might be able to censor us, but our data would really be signed over the minute that we sign up to use the site, because there's no federal legislation that's keeping companies like Facebook, Twitter from harvesting our data and manipulating it to their benefit.
To that point, and your point earlier, Mike, all these members of Congress are, speaking down on Facebook and what Facebook's done, and they've been coming out saying, "I said this years ago," but at the end of the day, they haven't done anything. Like everyone's acknowledged this issue, and both sides, kind of agree, but no one's doing anything when there seems to be room to do something. So it's extremely ironic.
Yeah, and I think part of it is like, frankly, a lot of these legislators are too old. They don't really understand what they're talking about. There was a clip I saw of Blumenthal trying to grill one of, I think it was Facebook executives about shutting down Finsta as a service. Fully not understanding that Finsta is not in fact a service. It's a phenomenon that, younger people have multiple accounts so that they can, increase their privacy. And like, if your legislators who are tasked with creating the rules and regulations around it fundamentally don't understand what they're talking about, then how can we expect common sense legislation that truly protects the users? Because the users clearly know what they're doing more so than the lawmakers. So I think part of the problem is also that we don't have legislators who either are capable or are willing to truly understand it before and then taking action based on their new understanding.
And, when we talk about this, this is affecting the whole planet. This is one problem that the United States is not unique in having. Germany, for instance, handled this problem by enacting the Network Enforcement Act in 2017. And, even though this act doesn't impose new obligations for social media, it does impose heavy fines for noncompliance with existing legislation. And it creates rules for the investigation and removal of illegal content hosted by networks with a very large number of registered users. And then, China, Egypt, France, Israel, Malaysia, and Russia, they've all enacted narrowly focused legislation that imposes sanctions on social media networks that are responsible for spreading false news. And, in my view, then you're going to get into First Amendment territory. And, the same conservatives that are willing to do it with Facebook, they have to be willing to do it when it comes down to Newsmax, in my view, and Fox, because it's not just through the computer where false news is, and disinformation is shared, but, through the TV screens. The average person has access to Fox more than, a cable news network like CNN or MSNBC. And, this it requires a holistic solution, in my view.
Yeah, but they don't want to do that because the problem is not Newsmax or Fox. The problem is, from Ted Cruz's point of view, the biased, liberal leaning tech companies. Those are the problem. Newsmax is just telling the truth. And that is the hypocrisy of it, is that they don't, with Ted Cruz and Blumenthal criticizing Google are coming at it from two really different directions. They really have two different end games. And there's a lack of sincerity, there's hypocrisy, and as Ms. Knopf said, you got a bunch of old dudes who don't know what they're doing, and they don't, and that's sort of okay if they would listen to younger people on their staffs, but because they can't get their heads around it, their staff talking to them doesn't mean anything. They don't know what their kids are saying to them. It's like, what are they talking about?
Yeah. What's interesting is that both sides seem to be feeling like they're not being treated fairly on Facebook, in terms of ad contributions and spending and, what's being shared. And then these algorithms target what you like and go ahead and share. And, even when they did experiments with people who, weren't even trying to do anything political, all of a sudden, because they have friends who associate with certain ideologies or parties, that same content that their friends see show up on their own newsfeed. So, this is a very intricate system and a problem. But in the last remaining minutes of the show, I do want to touch on environmental justice. I've got, interned with Congressman Don McKeechin, Cassandra's on, and, I've had my, hand in environmental justice, somewhat at Howard Law School. But members of the environmental justice movement sent an email this week over 5,600 times over a 48-hour period to top Biden administration officials, and this disrupted White House communications and sparked a tense exchange between the administration's chief environmental outreach officer and one of the key leaders of the movement. The form letter blast effectively shut down email communications over 2 August days. Patterson said that, they learned those details when, David Keeve, who was the council director, the National Economic Council director, called her to express dismay in a 17-minute conversation that she characterized as aggressive and offensive. Patterson said it's really outrageous, and with all the crisis our communities are facing right now, that all this energy and aggression was focused on receiving emails. Keeve, the National Economic Council director, declined to respond. There's obviously a back and forth, but at issue is whether the Biden administration will make good on its promises to reduce environmental pollution and invest in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Environmental justice veterans commended Biden's unprecedented pledges to address these concerns. You're talking about the Justice 40 initiative, the commitment to have 40% of all spending that goes towards environmental justice being spent to rectify the harms of landfills and all kinds of toxic pollutant facilities being strategically placed in communities of color or near communities of color, causing asthma, causing all kinds of respiratory problems and diseases, reducing the value of property. I want to get your thoughts on this, on whether the Biden administration is doing enough, or whether or not those who are criticizing them for not doing more have a point.
I think that there's two things. One, I think the Biden administration's actions and rhetoric so far has been very on point, and it's been very promising. But I think that the main concern and the reason behind this rhetoric and this blast from activists is because it's things that they've heard before. In previous administrations, especially under President Trump, it was very obvious that this was not going to be a priority because they were very blatant about it. They were rolling back all kinds of environmental concerns. They were not listening. There was no access. What we have now is all kinds of access, but it's access to discussion. There's not any tangible actions yet. And we've seen some tangible actions from the Biden administration actually being pro fossil fuel industries, which seems to sort of cut against the promises that he seems to be making. And so I see, especially considering the unprecedented number of environmental disasters, not just our country, but the world have been facing in the last 2 years, even in the last couple of months, really. And it's an urgent issue. It's an issue that people are losing their homes, losing their lives, losing their health over. And it's been going on forever. We had Katrina in 2004, and then we had the winter vortex that hit Texas and knocked out the entire grid. I mean, we are seeing people losing homes and lives. And here's another example. There's lead abatement programs. They haven't been truly successful in a lot of places, specifically places that are primarily African American. So there's layers. There's things that have been promised. There's things that have been started, but are slowly rolling, if they're rolling at all. So I understand, and I actually commend these environmental justice leaders for doing what they did, because it was an annoyance for 48 hours for the White House, but they said, you're going to actually listen to us. You're not going to hear us and then ignore us. So I don't know. It was a stunt that grabbed attention. And I sincerely hope that because they've demonstrated that they're very serious, and we, as the citizens of the United States, are serious about it, it will put a fire under the administration to continue to make good on these promises and possibly, roll back on some of these fossil fuel initiatives that they've moved forward with, which is just a continuation of past policy. It's not new. It's not innovative. It seems to be more of the same. I think that's really where the irritation and the anger was sparked.
Yeah, and you have, the Biden administration is the first administration to actually have an environmental justice advisory council, for the White House. That's the first. And so, it shows that, environmental justice is not just something. Plus, you had 2 executive orders from this administration specifically for environmental justice. But you still have veterans saying, we're not seeing tangible results 9 months into the presidency. In some instances, according to Peggy Shepard, who co-chairs the Biden-created White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She said in some instances, there seems to be a dichotomy between what the administration says they're committed to and what's happening on the ground. What do you make of those criticisms? And what do you make of that as we close?
I think that we have to exert patience, which I know that's not a popular thing, and I know that's not what people want to hear because everybody wants it now. The reality is that President Biden inherited four alarm fires in every corner. He had, the pandemic that was ravaging that he had to get under control, which he inherited from his predecessor, in which there was absolutely no plan for anything. He had the situation in Afghanistan, which, of course, since the Trump administration refused to communicate with the incoming Biden administration, he wasn't even aware of this deadline or the communications or anything. I just think there's so many things on the agenda and so many things that are incredibly pressing. I just think that people, as irritating as it may be and as unpopular as it may be, you're just going to kind of have to wait your turn. There's just so many things happening, and not that the environment is not important, but if we don't get a handle on the pandemic, there's no environment to have because we'll all be dead. So we have to put things in their level of extreme importance. And I believe just by what we've seen with them creating these different boards and just really taking completely different steps than we've seen from any other administration to really tackle these issues, that there is an agenda and there is a plan to get us where we need to be. But I just don't think it's going to happen as quickly as others may want it to happen. But I don't think because it's not happening right this second that it doesn't hold a level of importance. I think it definitely does. I just think there's so many things that they have to attend to. It's just impossible to have an expectation that they're going to be able to get to everything. He hasn't even been in office for a full year yet.
Well, Chloe Andwiza, Justin Perkins, Cassandra Knopf, Tasha Bryant, Professor Cook, thank you so much for such a rich discussion tonight. This episode 48, I think, was a success. It was a really great episode, in my view. And I want to thank those of you who tuned in or will go back and watch this. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks for your viewership and support. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 48 of the Political Mic. Thank you all so much, and I wish you a good evening.
Yeah.